London, June, 1818. The library of Lindsay House in Mayfair stood in shadow, bathed in the soft, flickering light of a single candelabra that Damien had just kindled, its glow fighting the gloom more effectively than the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. The room smelled of leather bindings and beeswax, of old paper and the faint trace of tobacco that clung to the velvet curtains despite years of airing. It was past midnight, and the household slept, save for one restless soul seeking refuge among books that asked nothing of her except to be read. Miss Imogen Fairchild stood before the shelves in her nightdress and wrapper, dark chestnut hair escaping its plait to frame a face more striking than beautiful. At 24, she had long since accepted her fate. Too old for a debut, too plain to attract notice, too useful to her family to be spared for courtship. She had raised 3 younger siblings after her mother died, bringing the last into the world, had managed her father's household and accounts with the precision that came naturally to a merchant's daughter, and had buried any foolish dreams of romance beneath layers of practical responsibility. Now she was in London for her sister's sake, chaperoning the beautiful Cecilia through a season sponsored by the powerful Dowager Countess of Lindsay. And Imogen was precisely what she had always been: overlooked. It was then that the library door opened and everything changed. If stories of practical women discovering they are worthy of passion move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Lord Damien Harcourt, the Earl of Lindsay, stood in the doorway with an unopened bottle of brandy in his hand and devastation written across features that society called handsome. He was 29 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray-green eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much for too long. His cravat was loosened, his evening coat discarded somewhere between the ballroom and this sanctuary, and he looked like a man who had reached the end of something. He saw her then, really saw her, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been embarrassment. "You are the merchant's daughter," he said, his voice rough. "The other one, not the pretty one." The words landed like a slap, casual and cutting in the way that only truth delivered without thought could be. Imogen felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt the familiar sting of being overlooked and found wanting, but something in his tone, something almost questioning, as if he were trying to place her in the elaborate machinery of the social world, made her straighten her spine instead of fleeing. "And you are the dissolute earl who was supposedly reformed," she replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "though clearly that reformation has not taken. Which are you tonight, my lord? The rake or the penitent?" For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then, to her complete astonishment, he laughed. It was a real laugh, not the practiced social performance she had heard from him at dinners and card parties, but something genuine and almost shocked. "Neither," he said finally, setting the unopened bottle on a nearby table with a decisive thunk. "Tonight, I am simply a man who is drowning and who found someone in the library who actually speaks her mind instead of simpering platitudes." He moved further into the room, and in the candlelight, Imogen could see the shadows under his eyes, the fine lines of tension around his mouth. This was not a man lost in dissipation. This was a man carrying a weight that was crushing him. "Drowning in what?" she asked, and perhaps it was the hour, or the strangeness of the encounter, or simply that she had nothing left to lose, but she found herself genuinely curious. Damien studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. But before he could answer, Imogen's gaze drifted to the open ledger on his desk. She stepped closer, her eye catching a column of figures. "You have calculated the grain yields incorrectly," she observed, her finger tracing the error. "Here. You have compounded the quarterly loss twice. It paints a far bleaker picture than the reality." Damien stared at the page, then at her, stunned. He checked the math himself, a frown marring his brow, before looking back at her with a new respect dawning in his eyes. He crossed to the writing desk, retrieved a leather folder bulging with papers, and handed it to her. Debt, he said simply. 40,000 pounds of debt, to be precise. My father gambled away our fortune before he died 4 years ago. Wasted on slow horses at Tattersall's and investments in phantom mines. I have been selling properties, negotiating with creditors, and maintaining appearances ever since. Society forgives moral failings, Miss Fairchild. It does not forgive financial ones. Imogen opened the folder, her practiced eye scanning the jumbled papers within. Bills of sale, promissory notes, desperate letters from solicitors. It was a catastrophe, made worse by the obvious signs of someone trying to manage it alone without expertise. "This is chaos," she said bluntly. "You have no method, no order, no scheme beyond stemming the immediate tide of ruin. Your creditors are circling like sharks because they sense weakness." "Thank you for that assessment," Damien replied dryly. "Most encouraging." But Imogen was already moving to the desk, spreading papers across its surface with the efficient movements of someone who knew precisely what she was doing. For 6 years, she had managed her father's textile accounts, had negotiated with suppliers and tracked shipments, and found efficiencies where none seemed possible. This was her element, the place where her mind worked with the clarity and precision that made her valuable, even if it did not make her marriageable. "Show me everything," she said. "Every debt, every asset, every income source. I can help you." Damien moved to stand beside her, close enough that the scent of ink and sandalwood drifted between them, a tangible presence in the quiet room. "Why would you do that?" Imogen looked up at him, meeting those gray-green eyes directly. "Because I understand what it is to be trapped by duty and expectation. Because I am good with numbers and strategy, and you are drowning. And because, for once in my useful, practical, overlooked life, I would like to be of service to someone who actually needs what I have to offer rather than simply expecting it." Something shifted in his expression then, something that made her breath catch. "You are not invisible," he said quietly. "Not to me. Not anymore." They worked through the night, heads bent over ledgers and letters. At one point, Damien reached for a document just as she did, and his fingers brushed hers. The contact was brief, a mere whisper of skin against skin, but it sent a jolt of awareness through Imogen that had nothing to do with accounting. She saw the shape of salvation in the numbers, saw where economies could be made and which creditors could be negotiated with and which properties could be sold to best advantage. She drafted a scheme for the coming years, methodical and achievable, and watched Damien's face transform from despair to something that might have been hope. "This could work," he said, as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the windows. "With discipline and time, this could actually work." "It will require sacrifice," Imogen warned. "Economies that society will notice. You will have to close the London house for next season, reduce staff, forego expenditures that maintain your social standing." "My social standing is built on lies," Damien replied. "Let it crumble. I would rather have truth and solvency than pretense and bankruptcy." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and Imogen realized with a shock that somewhere in the hours of working together, something had shifted between them. She saw admiration in his eyes, respect, something that might even have been the beginning of affection. "Meet me here tomorrow afternoon," she said, gathering the papers with hands that trembled slightly. "We will begin implementing this plan. Your mother need not know the full extent of the situation, but we will need to coordinate carefully." "Tomorrow," Damien agreed. "And Miss Fairchild?" "Thank you. I have been carrying this alone for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to have an ally." Imogen fled to her rooms before she could do something foolish like confess that she had never had an ally either, that she too had been carrying burdens alone, and that for the first time in her life, she felt seen. The days that followed brought an unexpected shift in Imogen's carefully ordered world. She and Damien met in the library each afternoon, ostensibly to address correspondence while the household rested, but in reality to wage war on his debts with the precision of generals planning a campaign. Imogen later learned that the Dowager Countess herself had ensured the servants turned a blind eye to these improper meetings. They wrote to creditors, renegotiated terms, identified properties that could be sold quickly and advantageously. Imogen discovered that Damien, beneath the facade of dissolute rake, possessed a sharp mind and a dry wit that made her laugh in ways she had not laughed in years. More dangerously, she discovered that she was falling in love with him. It happened in small moments, the way his face lit with genuine pleasure when she found a solution to a seemingly impossible problem. The care with which he listened to her opinions, treating them as valuable rather than oddities to be indulged. The evening he found her in the drawing room, exhausted from chaperoning Cecilia through yet another ball, and brought her tea without being asked, sitting beside her in companionable silence while the house settled into sleep. "You look after everyone," he observed, watching her over the rim of his cup. "Who looks after you?" "I look after myself," Imogen replied, deflecting as she always did. "I am quite capable." "Capable is not the same as cared for," Damien said quietly. "You deserve both, you know. You deserve to be more than useful." The words lodged in her chest like a physical ache, and Imogen had to look away before she did something mortifyingly foolish like cry or confess that she had been useful her entire life, but had never felt particularly wanted until he looked at her as if she were extraordinary. But she was not extraordinary. She was practical and plain and past the age where romantic dreams were appropriate. And Damien, for all his financial troubles, was the Earl, a man who moved in circles so far above her father's new money that they might as well have inhabited different worlds. Besides, she knew why he truly needed her. To save his estate, to restore his family's fortune, he would need to marry an heiress, someone with wealth enough to absorb his debts and still maintain social standing. And Imogen, for all her father's success in textiles, was the wrong kind of rich for that world. Too commercial, too recently elevated, too associated with trade. Damien had even once confessed, in a moment of bitter honesty, that while her own dowry was substantial, his peers would mercilessly mock an earl who used trade money to bail out his ancient title. He needed aristocratic gold to gild his crumbling walls. The social rounds continued. Cecilia, beautiful and sweet-natured, attracted suitors like flowers drew bees, and Imogen shadowed her through ballrooms and garden parties, a dutiful chaperone in modest gowns who watched from the sidelines while others danced. She had perfected the art of blending in over years of practice, knew how to make herself small and unobtrusive, knew how to smile politely at the pitying glances that said, "Poor plain thing, still here, still hopeful, still foolish." But now, when she stood in ballrooms watching Cecilia dance, she would catch Damien's eye across the room, and something would pass between them that felt like a shared secret. He saw her. In a world that looked through her, he saw her, and it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. It was then that Mr. Gerald Waverley entered the picture, solid and respectable in a way that made Imogen's heart sink even as she recognized the wisdom of what he represented. Waverley was 45, a shipping magnate whose first wife had died 2 years prior, leaving him with a comfortable fortune and a vague desire for companionship. He was not handsome, but neither was he unattractive. He possessed a kind face, a patient demeanor, and a pragmatic view of marriage that matched Imogen's own supposed sensibilities. "Miss Fairchild," he said, approaching her at a musicale where she sat knitting while Cecilia sang with a cluster of other young ladies. "I wondered if I might have the pleasure of your conversation during the interval." They walked in the garden while the next performance was arranged, and Waverley spoke of his business ventures, his late wife, his hope for a sensible second marriage built on mutual respect rather than youthful passion. "I understand you are a practical woman," he said, offering his arm as they navigated a path between rose bushes heavy with summer blooms. "That is a quality I admire greatly. I have no need for romantic theatrics at my age. What I require is a capable partner who can manage a household, engage intelligently in conversation, and perhaps provide companionship in the evening years." I believe we could suit admirably. It was not a proposal, not yet, but the intention was clear. Imogen recognized it for what it was. A reasonable offer, security, comfort, a life where she would be valued for precisely the qualities that made her useful rather than loved. Where she would never have to fear being too plain, too old, too much of whatever she inevitably was that made men look past her towards someone prettier and younger and more amenable. "You are very kind, Mr. Waverley," she replied, because he was kind in his way. "I will consider your words carefully." That evening, Damien found her in the library, staring at the account books they had been working through without truly seeing the numbers. "Waverley was speaking to you in the garden," he said without preamble, and there was something sharp in his voice, something almost like pain. "I saw you walking together." "He is a respectable man with honorable intentions," Imogen replied, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "My father is quite pleased by the attention." "Are you pleased by it?" The question hung between them, weighted with everything they had not said, everything they could not say. Imogen looked at Damien and saw a man trapped by circumstance, bound by duty to marry wealth if he wished to save his estate, and she would not, could not, make this harder for him than it already was. "He offers security," she said finally. "That is no small thing for a woman in my position." "Your position," Damien repeated, and there was bitterness in his tone now. "You speak as if you are some desperate creature without options, but you are brilliant, Imogen. You are extraordinary. You deserve far more than security." The use of her Christian name, spoken with such intensity, made her breath catch. They had never addressed each other so informally, had maintained the careful barriers of propriety even as they worked side by side for weeks. "What I deserve and what I can expect are two different things," Imogen replied, and she heard the weariness in her own voice, the resignation that came from years of knowing her place. "I am not beautiful like Cecilia. I am not young enough to inspire romantic notions. I am 24 years old, plain-featured, and the daughter of a merchant. Mr. Waverley sees me as I am, and still offers respect and companionship. That is more than I expected to receive." Damien crossed the room in 3 strides, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could see the muscle working in his jaw as he struggled with something. "I see you as you are," he said roughly. "And what I see is someone remarkable, someone who took my disaster and found hope in it, someone who speaks her mind and challenges me and makes me laugh for the first time in years, someone who is beautiful precisely because she does not realize it." Imogen's heart hammered against her ribs. "Damien, you must not say such things. You know as well as I do that you need to marry wealth. Your mother has been orchestrating your introduction to heiresses all season. Lady Helena Montclair, Miss Georgiana Sutherland. Women with dowries that could settle your debts in a single stroke." "I know what I need," Damien replied, and the words came out like a confession. "But what I need and what I want are not the same, and I find myself increasingly unable to reconcile the two." Before Imogen could respond, before she could process what he might mean, voices echoed in the hallway beyond the library, and they sprang apart like guilty conspirators. The moment shattered, and Damien left without another word, leaving Imogen standing alone among the account books, with her heart in turmoil and her mind spinning with impossible possibilities. 3 days later, the Dowager Countess of Lindsay hosted a garden party at the townhouse, an elaborate affair with musicians and refreshments, and seemingly half of fashionable London crowding the carefully manicured grounds. Imogen kept to the shadows as usual, watching Cecilia enchant a circle of young men while she herself faded into the background like furniture. She was considering retreating to the library when a footman approached with a message that Cecilia required her presence urgently near the eastern garden path. Concerned, Imogen followed the directions through increasingly secluded portions of the grounds until she found her sister on a bench partially hidden by climbing roses, and she was not alone. Mr. Edmund Fairfax, the second son of an earl and a known rake and companion of Damien's from his supposedly dissolute days, had his hands where they most decidedly should not be, and Cecilia was struggling to extricate herself from an embrace she clearly had not invited. Fury, white-hot and absolute, swept through Imogen. She strode forward without thought for propriety or consequence. "Remove your hands from my sister immediately," she commanded, her voice cutting through Fairfax's practiced seduction like a blade. "Step away from her now, or I will scream loud enough to bring every guest in this garden down upon your head." Fairfax released Cecilia, but did not appear remotely chastened. Instead, he straightened his cravat with an infuriating smirk. "Such dramatics, Miss Fairchild. Your sister and I were merely enjoying a moment of privacy. No harm done." "No harm?" Imogen positioned herself between Cecilia and this predator, protecting her sister as she had always done. "You attempted to compromise her, to force a marriage through scandal. I know precisely what you intended." "And what will you do about it?" Fairfax challenged, stepping closer with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "I am a gentleman of quality, and you are the daughter of a merchant, a nobody playing at gentility in borrowed rooms. It would be most unfortunate if whispers were to arise suggesting that you were the one seeking to entrap a husband, would it not?" The words were meant to wound, meant to remind her of her place, but Imogen had stopped caring about her place the moment this man put his hands on her sister. "They will believe the truth," she replied, her voice deadly calm. "And I will ensure they hear it, even if I must stand in the center of every ballroom in London and proclaim your behavior. You will be ruined, Fairfax. Not us, you." But even as she spoke, she saw the calculation in his eyes, saw him weighing her threat against his social armor, and she knew with sickening certainty that he was right. In this world, his word would carry more weight than hers, and the scandal would destroy Cecilia's prospects while barely touching him. It was then that a new voice cut through the garden, cold and controlled and carrying the weight of authority. "I believe the lady asked you to step away, Fairfax. I suggest you comply immediately." Damien emerged from the path behind them, and his face was a study in controlled fury. He had followed them, Imogen realized. He had seen Fairfax lead Cecilia away, and known his friend's reputation well enough to intervene. Fairfax's smirk faltered. "Lindsay, this is no concern of yours." "On the contrary," Damien replied, his tone pleasant in the way that tigers might purr before striking. "When you attempt to compromise the sister of my intended bride in my mother's garden, it becomes very much my concern. Now I will give you a choice. You will leave this garden, leave this party, and leave London entirely by tomorrow morning. Or I will ensure that every detail of your attempt to entrap Miss Cecilia Fairchild becomes public knowledge, that every creditor you owe money to receives encouragement to call in your debts immediately, and that your father learns precisely why his son is no longer welcome in decent society." The threat was delivered with such icy precision that Fairfax paled visibly. He knew Damien's reputation for ruthlessness when crossed, knew that despite his financial troubles, Lindsay still carried enough social weight to destroy him utterly. "This is not over," Fairfax hissed, but he was already backing away, defeated. "Oh, I rather think it is," Damien replied. "Go now, before I change my mind about being merciful." Fairfax fled, but the look in his eyes promised retribution. He would leave London, yes, but he would leave a trail of poison in his wake. Damien immediately turned to Cecilia, his voice gentling. "Are you harmed, Miss Cecilia?" The girl was crying now, the shock and fear catching up with her. Imogen wrapped her arms around her sister, murmuring comfort while her own mind raced through the implications. They had avoided the worst, but there had been guests in the garden. Someone might have seen. Rumors might spread regardless. And Imogen knew, with a chill in her heart, that if she were ruined, Cecilia would be ruined by association. No respectable man would marry the sister of a fallen woman. She was risking everything not just for herself, but for Cecilia's future. "We need to get her inside," Imogen said urgently. "Repair any damage to her appearance. Make it seem as though nothing happened." Damien nodded and quickly surveyed the area. The eastern path leads back to the house through the conservatory. Few guests venture there. "Go now, quickly. I will ensure no one follows or questions your absence." They moved swiftly, Imogen supporting her trembling sister, while Damien created a diversion by engaging a group of gentlemen in loud conversation at the garden's main entrance. They reached Cecilia's room without incident, and Imogen worked with practiced efficiency to smooth her sister's hair, straighten her gown, and restore her composure. "I am so sorry," Cecilia whispered, tears still streaming down her face. "He said he wished to show me a rare rose variety. I thought it would be safe. I thought there would be others nearby. I never imagined he would go so far." "Hush," Imogen soothed, wiping her sister's tears with gentle fingers. "You did nothing wrong. He is a predator who took advantage of your innocence and trust. But you are safe now, and we will ensure he can never harm you again." But even as she spoke the reassurances, Imogen's mind was cataloging risks. Fairfax was wounded and angry. Men like that sought revenge. They had made an enemy today, and she could only hope that Damien's threats had been sufficient to contain him. They returned to the party an hour later, Cecilia pale but composed, and Imogen heard the whispers before she even reached the main terrace. Subtle glances, raised fans. The particular quality of malicious interest that meant gossip was spreading like wildfire through the assembled guests. Someone had seen, someone had talked. The evening passed in mounting dread. Imogen kept Cecilia close, watching faces for signs of scandal, listening to conversations for her sister's name, and she saw, with growing horror, that the target of the whispers was not Cecilia at all. It was her. Lady Ashbourne, a woman known for her vicious tongue and her enjoyment of others' misfortunes, held court near the fountain with a circle of eager listeners. Her voice, pitched to carry, drifted across the garden with poisonous clarity. "I saw her, my dears, following not one but two gentlemen into the secluded paths, most improper. And they say she is chaperoning her sister? A fine guardian she makes, engaging in her own scandalous behavior while the pretty one is left unattended. Perhaps she hoped to trap one of them?" Another voice added, equally malicious. "After all, at her age and with her lack of prospects, desperation might drive one to extreme measures." "Merchant blood," Lady Ashbourne pronounced with satisfaction. "They simply do not understand propriety. Grasping and unsuitable, the lot of them. Mark my words, this entire family will be ruined by association before the season ends." The words felt like physical blows. Imogen stood frozen as the implications crashed over her. Fairfax had taken his revenge in the cruelest way possible. He had twisted the afternoon's events, had spread rumors that made her, not Cecilia, the subject of scandal. Her reputation was being destroyed even as she stood there, and with it, her sister's prospects, her father's business connections, everything they had worked toward this season. Cecilia, standing beside her, had gone white as snow. "Imogen, they are saying you compromised yourself. They are saying you were with Fairfax and Lord Lindsay both. They think you attempted to entrap them." "I know," Imogen replied, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "I heard." Across the garden, she could see her father, Sir Richard, a wealthy merchant knight, in conversation with business associates, unaware yet of the catastrophe unfolding. Could see Damien speaking urgently with his mother near the house. Could see the way guests were beginning to look at her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. This was how reputations died, swiftly, mercilessly. A woman's character destroyed by whispers and insinuation, and there was no defense, no recourse, no way to prove innocence against the weight of society's judgment. Mr. Waverley approached then, his kind face troubled. He drew Imogen aside with the careful courtesy of someone handling something fragile and broken. "Miss Fairchild," he said quietly, "I have heard the most distressing rumors this evening. I cannot in good conscience continue my attentions under these circumstances. I hope you understand. My position in society requires a wife of unimpeachable reputation. I wish you well, truly I do, but I must withdraw my interest." He left without waiting for a response, and Imogen watched him go with a strange sense of detachment. There went security. There went her sensible future. There went everything except the truth, which would not save her because truth mattered less than perception in this world of careful appearances and vicious whispers. It was then that the library door opened later that night. Imogen had fled the party as soon as propriety allowed, had taken refuge among the books where she had first encountered Damien and discovered what it felt like to be seen. Now she sat in darkness, dry-eyed and numb, contemplating the ruins of a reputation she had never particularly valued until it was gone. "You should not be here," she said without turning when she heard footsteps approach. She knew those steps, had learned to recognize them over weeks of working together. "It will only make the scandal worse." "The scandal is already as bad as it can be," Damien replied, and there was fury in his voice, tightly leashed but unmistakable. Fairfax spread his poison well. "By morning, all of London will believe you deliberately compromised yourself with multiple men in a desperate bid for marriage." "He won," Imogen said simply. "He wanted revenge, and he found the perfect target, a merchant's daughter playing at gentility. No one will question his version of events. My word means nothing against his. Your word means everything to me." The words, spoken with such conviction, made something crack in Imogen's carefully maintained composure. She turned to look at Damien, this complicated man who had somehow become the center of her world, and she saw anguish in his face. "I am so sorry," he continued, moving closer. "I never imagined Fairfax would do this. I thought my threats would be enough to contain him. I was wrong, and you are paying the price for my miscalculation." "You saved my sister," Imogen reminded him. "That is what matters. Cecilia's reputation remains intact. Her season can continue. My father's business connections remain stable. The sacrifice of my standing is a reasonable price for protecting them." "Do not speak of yourself as a sacrifice," Damien said sharply. "You are not some expendable piece on a chessboard. You are Imogen Fairchild, the most brilliant woman I have ever known, and you deserve better than this." "I am a merchant's daughter who forgot her place," Imogen replied, and she heard the bitterness in her own voice. "That is what they are saying, is it not? That I reached above my station and am being justly punished for my presumption." Before Damien could respond, there was a knock at the library door, and Mr. Waverley entered with an air of determination that seemed at odds with his earlier withdrawal. He looked at Imogen, then at Damien, and his expression was both kind and inexorable. "Forgive the intrusion," Waverley said, "but I felt I must speak with you, Miss Fairchild, before the night concluded. I have reconsidered my earlier words." Hope, foolish and painful, flickered in Imogen's chest. Perhaps he had decided to overlook the scandal after all. Perhaps security was not entirely lost. "I am proposing to you," Waverley continued, and his tone was that of a man making a reasonable business offer. "Not because I disbelieve the rumors, you understand. I have no particular opinion on what occurred this afternoon. But I am proposing because I believe a swift marriage will mitigate the worst of the scandal. You will have security and respectability. I will have a capable wife who understands her good fortune in receiving such an offer under these circumstances. It is practical for both of us." The offer hung in the air between them, and Imogen understood with painful clarity what it represented. Salvation, of a sort. A way forward. She would be married to a man who believed she had compromised herself, who was offering charity disguised as matrimony, who would always see her as someone fortunate to have been rescued rather than truly valued. It was everything sensible and nothing she wanted. "That is extraordinarily generous of you, Mr. Waverley," she said carefully. "Might I have a moment to consider?" "Of course," Waverley replied, glancing at Damien with barely concealed disapproval. Though I would counsel swift acceptance, such offers are not extended frequently to ladies in your current position. He departed, leaving silence in his wake. Imogen could feel Damien staring at her, could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a fire. "You will refuse him," Damien said, and it was not quite a question. "I do not know," Imogen admitted. "He offers security, respectability, a way to contain the scandal before it destroys my entire family." "Is that not what a sensible woman would accept?" "A sensible woman," Damien repeated, and suddenly he was moving toward her, closing the distance between them with swift purpose. "You keep speaking of sense and practicality as if those are the only things that matter. What about what you want, Imogen? What about what you feel?" "What I feel is irrelevant," she replied, but her voice shook slightly. "I have always known that. Feelings are a luxury for beautiful women with dowries and prospects. I am neither beautiful nor prospects, and my feelings have never signified in any decision about my future." "They signify to me," Damien said fiercely. "Do you understand that? You matter to me, not your accounts management or your strategic planning or your usefulness. You. The woman who challenges me and sees through me and makes me want to be better than I am. The woman I fell in love with somewhere between midnight confessions and afternoon conspiracies." Imogen's breath caught in her throat. "You cannot mean that. You need to marry an heiress. Your estate requires it. I am precisely the wrong kind of woman for you." "I need you," Damien corrected. "Everything else is negotiable. We will find another way to save the estate. We will economize more severely, sell more properties, take more time. But I cannot negotiate myself into wanting someone else, and I will not watch you marry a man who sees you as a convenient solution to a scandal when you deserve to be seen as extraordinary." He reached for her hands, holding them between his own, and Imogen felt the warmth of his touch like a brand against her skin. "I have nothing to offer you," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I am drowning in debt. I have been lying to society for years about my circumstances. I am the worst possible choice for a practical woman seeking security. But I love you, Imogen. I love your brilliance and your strength and the way you take impossible situations and find hope in them. I love that you speak your mind and make me laugh and see me as more than my title or my debts. And if you will have me, if you will take this risk with me, I swear I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that I see you exactly as you are, and that what I see is everything I want." Tears were streaming down Imogen's face now, years of loneliness and resignation breaking apart under the weight of being truly wanted. But even as her heart soared, her practical mind catalogued the obstacles between them. "Damien, even if I wanted to accept you, which I do, desperately, the scandal will only worsen if we announce an engagement now. Society will assume I successfully entrapped you. Your reputation will suffer along with mine. Your mother will—" "My mother," a new voice interrupted from the library doorway, "is standing right here, and she would appreciate being consulted before decisions are made about her son's future." The Dowager Countess of Lindsay swept into the room with the imperious grace of someone who had commanded London society for 3 decades. She looked between Imogen and Damien with an expression that was impossible to read, and Imogen felt her heart sink. Of course the Dowager Countess would object. She was an earl's widow, a woman of impeccable lineage, and Imogen was nothing more than a merchant's daughter caught in scandal. "Your Grace," Imogen began, preparing to offer apologies and explanations. But the Dowager Countess held up one elegant hand to silence her. "Miss Fairchild," she said, her tone thoughtful, "your daughter has ruined my son." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling with terrible implications. Imogen froze. Her father, Sir Richard, who had appeared behind the Dowager Countess, looked as though he might be ill. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, a silent guillotine blade poised to fall. Ruin, financial restitution, exile from society. The terror was absolute. "Your Grace, I assure you, I never meant to—" But the Dowager Countess was smiling now, a slow, satisfied smile that transformed her austere features into something almost mischievous. "Excellent," she continued, as if Imogen had not spoken. "Now he will marry you, which is precisely what I have been attempting to engineer for weeks." Stunned silence filled the library. Imogen stared at the Dowager Countess, trying to parse words that made no sense. Beside her, Damien had gone completely still. "Mother," he said carefully, "what exactly are you saying?" The Dowager Countess moved further into the room, settling herself in a chair with the air of someone preparing to deliver a lecture. "I am saying that I have been watching you both for weeks, every afternoon in this library, supposedly addressing correspondence, but actually working through Damien's financial catastrophe together. Do you truly believe I did not know what was occurring under my own roof? I bribed the servants to ensure your privacy myself." She turned her gaze to Imogen, and there was warmth in her eyes, genuine affection that made Imogen's throat tighten. "I have spent this season introducing my stubborn son to every eligible heiress in London," the Dowager Countess continued, "watching him treat them with perfect courtesy and absolutely no interest whatsoever. And then I observed him with you, Miss Fairchild. I saw the way he looked at you when you were absorbed in ledgers. I saw him laugh, truly laugh, for the first time since his father's death. I saw him come alive again, and I knew that whatever financial benefit an heiress might bring, it would mean nothing if he spent the rest of his life married to someone who made him miserable." "You orchestrated this," Damien said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "The garden party, the secluded paths. You knew Fairfax would be there. You knew—" "I facilitated circumstances," the Dowager Countess corrected primly. "There is a difference. Fairfax's proclivities were well known to me. I suspected he might attempt something foolish, which is why I positioned servants to observe and report. I also ensured that enough guests witnessed the aftermath to create precisely the kind of scandal that would force action." Imogen felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "You deliberately arranged for my reputation to be destroyed?" "I arranged," the Dowager Countess said firmly, "for the pretense of scandal. There is a difference, and it is one I am about to demonstrate. Come, both of you. The guests are assembled in the ballroom, and I believe it is time to resolve this situation properly." She swept from the library without waiting to see if they would follow, and Damien and Imogen exchanged bewildered glances before hurrying after her. They emerged into the main hall to find it crowded with guests who should have departed hours ago, but who lingered still, drawn by the scent of scandal like moths to flame. The Dowager Countess ascended the stairs to the landing where she could address the entire assembly, and her voice when she spoke carried the absolute authority of someone who had ruled London society for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am sure you are all confused by the events of this evening, and I take full responsibility for that confusion. It is time to clarify matters." The crowd fell silent, every eye fixed on the Dowager Countess. Imogen, standing at the base of the stairs with Damien beside her, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Fairfax," the Dowager Countess announced, "took advantage of my hospitality this afternoon to spread vicious lies about Miss Imogen Fairchild. He did so because Miss Fairchild had the courage to protect her sister from his unwanted advances, and because she represents everything he cannot abide in a woman: intelligence, integrity, and the strength to stand against those who abuse their power." A ripple of shock moved through the assembled guests. Lady Ashbourne looked as though she had been struck. "Miss Fairchild," the Dowager Countess continued, "has been secretly betrothed to my son, the Earl of Lindsay, for several weeks. The scene in the garden this afternoon was Fairfax discovering this fact and attempting to destroy her reputation out of petty jealousy and wounded pride. Anyone who spreads his lies or questions Miss Fairchild's character will answer to me personally, And I assure you, that is not a conversation you wish to have." The pronouncement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Imogen felt Damien's hand find hers, squeezing gently, and she realized with dawning wonder that the Dowager Countess was saving her, saving them both. "Furthermore," the Dowager Countess added, her tone turning glacial as she looked directly at Lady Ashbourne, "I will remember every individual who participated in spreading gossip this evening. Those names will be noted. And when my son and his bride are hosting events in future, when they are part of society in their own right, I suspect they will remember as well which of you showed character when it mattered." The threat was clear. Cross the Dowager Countess of Lindsay, and one's social standing would suffer consequences that might last years. Imogen watched faces change, watched calculation replace malice, watched self-preservation overcome the urge to gossip. Lady Ashbourne, in particular, looked as though she might be ill. "Fairfax," the Dowager Countess concluded, "departed London this evening at my insistence. He will not return while I draw breath. And now, I believe my son has something he wishes to say to his intended bride." "Damien?" She gestured imperiously for them to join her on the landing, and Damien, still holding Imogen's hand, led her up the stairs. At the top, in full view of London society, he turned to face the crowd first. His expression was stern, his posture radiating the authority of his ancient title. He held the room's gaze, daring anyone to contradict the narrative his mother had spun, silently pledging his protection to the woman beside him. The heat of the ballroom, the scent of perfume and beeswax, the hush of the crowd, it all faded into the background. Then he turned to Imogen, his face softening, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur meant for her alone. "This is not how I wanted to do this," he whispered. "I wanted to court you properly, to give you the proposal you deserved, not this forced spectacle. But my mother is right about one thing. I have been a fool to wait." He knelt then, there on the landing before everyone, and the romantic gesture sent a collective gasp through the watching crowd. From his pocket, he produced a ring, and Imogen recognized it as the Lindsay family betrothal ring, a ruby surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to Damien's grandmother. "Imogen Fairchild," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the now silent ballroom. "You have seen me at my worst, and somehow found me worthy of your time and attention. You have taken my disasters and turned them into plans for salvation. You have made me laugh when I thought I had forgotten how. You have shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued, not for title or appearance, but for character and capability. I love you desperately, completely, and if you will do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, I promise to spend every day proving that I see you exactly as you are, brilliant, strong, and utterly extraordinary." Tears were streaming down Imogen's face again, but she was smiling now, smiling so widely her face hurt with it. "You impossible, ridiculous man," she said through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Damien slipped the ring onto her finger, rose, and kissed her there before all of London, thoroughly and properly, and without any regard for propriety whatsoever. The crowd erupted in applause, and Imogen heard feminine sighs mixed with masculine approval, heard the narrative reshaping itself before their very eyes from scandal to romance. When they finally broke apart, breathless and grinning, the Dowager Countess was watching them with undisguised satisfaction. "Finally," she said dryly, "you have both been dancing around this for weeks. Stubborn, proud, foolish children. I had to create a scandal simply to force you into admitting what everyone except yourselves could see clearly." Damien turned to his mother, torn between exasperation and affection. "You manipulated us. You orchestrated a public scandal to force my hand. I facilitated circumstances that allowed you to stop being idiotic," the Dowager Countess corrected. "There is a difference. Now, stop looking at me as though I have committed some terrible crime. I saved you from your own stubborn pride. You are welcome." Later that night, after the guests had finally departed, After Cecilia had hugged Imogen with tears of joy, and Sir Richard had grudgingly admitted that perhaps an earl was not such a terrible match after all, Imogen found herself alone with Damien once more in the library where everything had begun. "Are you certain?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes that still held traces of vulnerability. "Truly certain? We could claim the betrothal was fabricated for appearance's sake. You could still marry an heiress. I would understand." Damien cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said firmly. "We will face the financial challenges together. We will economize ruthlessly. We will sell properties and negotiate with creditors and build our future brick by brick if necessary. But we will do it together, as partners, as equals, as two people who chose each other despite every practical objection the world could raise." "It will be hard," Imogen warned. "Society will talk. Your peers will judge. The economies will be noticed and commented upon." "Let them talk," Damien replied. "Let them judge. I would rather have one lifetime with you, struggling together toward solvency, than a lifetime of comfort with someone who makes me feel as empty as I felt before I met you." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Imogen felt herself melting into his embrace, felt years of loneliness and resignation burning away in the heat of being genuinely wanted. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing in the sandalwood scent of him, feeling the solid warmth of his arms around her. "I love you," she whispered. "I have loved you since you laughed at my insult that first night, since you listened to my financial advice as though it mattered, since you saw me when I had spent so long being invisible." "You were never invisible to me," Damien murmured against her hair. "From the moment you told me my accounts were chaos, I was lost. I just did not have the courage to admit it until circumstances forced my hand." They married 3 weeks later in the private chapel at the Lindsay country estate, a small ceremony attended only by close family. Imogen wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her frame, and carried wildflowers picked that morning from the estate gardens. Damien wore his father's suit, and when he saw her walking down the aisle on her brother Marcus's arm, his eyes filled with such open emotion that Imogen felt her own tears start anew. Her father, still somewhat bewildered by the swift turn of events, gave his blessing with the grudging admission that his late wife would have approved. "She always said you needed someone who saw past the practicality to the person beneath," Sir Richard told Imogen before the ceremony. "I think perhaps you have found that." The Dowager Countess, resplendent in lavender silk, was absolutely not crying as she watched her son pledge his life to the merchant's daughter who had saved him in more ways than one. "They will be happy," she told Sir Richard with satisfaction. "It may not be the match I once envisioned, but it is the match he needs." The first year of marriage was precisely as difficult as Imogen had predicted. Lindsay Manor required repairs that had been deferred for years. The economies they implemented were noticed and commented upon by society. Staff had to be reduced, properties were sold. There were nights when they argued about money and pride, when Damien's aristocratic upbringing clashed with Imogen's merchant practicality, when the weight of £40,000 in debt felt overwhelming. But they learned. They adapted, they fought and reconciled, and slowly, painfully, built something sustainable together. Imogen's investment strategies began to pay dividends. Damien took his seat in the House of Lords and argued passionately for financial reforms that would protect heirs from inheriting impossible debts. They became known for hosting modest gatherings where conversation mattered more than elaborate meals, for supporting young couples struggling with financial difficulties, for proving that love and practical partnership could coexist. And through it all, through every argument and reconciliation, every victory and setback, they remained partners in the truest sense. Damien learned to value Imogen's merchant instincts rather than resenting them. Imogen learned to accept help rather than carrying every burden alone. They grew together, changed together, became something stronger than either had been separately. When Imogen discovered she was pregnant 9 months into their marriage, Damien wept openly with joy. When she gave birth to twin sons the following spring, howling and indignant and absolutely perfect, he held them with such careful reverence that Imogen fell in love with him all over again. The boys, whom they named Thomas and William, inherited Damien's gray-green eyes and Imogen's chestnut hair and the combined stubbornness of both parents. They were followed 2 years later by daughters Charlotte and Victoria, one practical and sharp-tongued like her mother, one dreamy and gentle like neither parent, and the Lindsay nursery became a place of cheerful chaos that horrified visiting aristocrats and delighted the Dowager Countess. 8 years after their marriage, on the occasion of the Dowager Countess's 75th birthday, the extended family gathered at the country estate. Cecilia, now Lady Somers after marrying a baron who genuinely adored her, arrived with her own 3 children. Marcus Fairchild, having successfully expanded their father's textile business, came with his wife. The house rang with laughter and noise and the particular joy that came from family who genuinely cared for one another. In a quiet moment, Imogen found herself on the terrace with the Dowager Countess, watching the children play in the gardens below. The older woman looked more fragile than she once had, but her eyes were still sharp, her mind still formidable. "Charlotte is quite a force," the Dowager Countess observed, watching Imogen's eldest daughter organize the younger children into some elaborate game. "She reminds me of you at that age, practical, capable, determined to manage everything." She gets that from both of us," Imogen replied with a smile. "Damien is far more organized than he pretends." "He is happy," the Dowager Countess said softly. "I see it in everything he does, in the way he looks at you, in his relationship with his children, in how he has transformed this estate from a burden into a home. I made the right choice that night, pushing you both toward what you were too stubborn to claim for yourselves." "You manipulated us shamelessly," Imogen reminded her, but there was no heat in the words, only affection. "I facilitated circumstances," the Dowager Countess corrected with a slight smile. "And I would do it again. You saved my son, Imogen, not just his finances, though you did that too. You saved him from a lifetime of going through the motions, from marrying for duty and living half a life. You gave him joy again. You gave him purpose. For that, I will always be grateful." "He saved me too," Imogen replied quietly. "He saw me when I had spent so long being invisible. He valued me when I thought I had nothing to offer except usefulness. He taught me that I deserved to be loved, not just needed." The Dowager Countess reached over and squeezed Imogen's hand. "You are a remarkable woman. I knew it the moment you walked into my house all those years ago. I am proud to call you daughter." That evening, after the children were finally asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Imogen found Damien in the library, their library, the place where everything had begun. He was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, and he smiled when she joined him. "Thinking about something?" she asked, slipping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "About everything and nothing," Damien replied, turning to pull her into a proper embrace. "About how different my life would be if I had not walked into this library 8 years ago and found a woman in a nightdress who was brave enough to call me dissolute." "You called me the not pretty one," Imogen reminded him. "That insult started everything." "It was not an insult," Damien protested. "It was an observation, and I was drunk and devastated and terrible at first impressions." "You were," Imogen agreed, smiling up at him. "You still are, actually. Every business associate I introduce you to thinks you are cold and arrogant until they spend 5 minutes in conversation with you." "That is your fault," Damien replied, kissing her forehead. "You made me think I could be honest instead of performing. Now, I have forgotten how to maintain the facade." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching moonlight paint silver patterns across the carpet, listening to the distant sounds of the estate settling for the night. 8 years of marriage had taught them the value of these quiet moments, the importance of simply being together without need for constant conversation. "Do you ever regret it?" Damien asked eventually, voicing the question that still haunted him occasionally. The scandal? The swift marriage? The years of struggle? You could have married Waverley, had comfort and ease and... Imogen placed her fingers against his lips, stopping the words. I would do it again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every struggle, every fight about money and pride and how to repair the roof. I would choose you again, Damien, every single time. Promise? He asked, and there was vulnerability in his voice that 8 years of marriage had not entirely erased. I promise, Imogen replied. Now stop asking foolish questions and kiss your wife properly. He did, thoroughly and deeply, and Imogen thought, not for the first time, that being seen by the right person, being chosen by someone who valued her for precisely who she was, had been worth every scandal and struggle. She had spent so long being practical and useful and invisible, had accepted that as her permanent state, and then Damien had looked at her in a moonlit library and seen something extraordinary. They had built a life together from fragments and determination, had transformed debt into solvency and scandal into legend, had created a family that knew love and laughter and the particular security that came from parents who genuinely adored each other. They had proved that practical women deserved passion, that choosing love over security could be the wisest decision, that partnership between equals could transform both people into something better than they had been alone. And as Imogen stood in Damien's arms, the Countess of Lindsay, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of their journey, even the painful parts, because they had led her here, to this man, to this family, to this improbable, extraordinary, thoroughly practical, happily ever after. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of Imogen and Damien's story. If this tale of finding love through unlikely circumstances touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and second chances that remind us all that being truly seen is the greatest gift we can give or receive.